Hey y'all, Lossien here, and today we're gonna turn all of this into this. So when I first started the 13 Witches of Halloween project, I knew that I really wanted to make one of the Sanderson sisters from Hocus Pocus. Now the question became, which sister to do? Obviously, I wanted to be the hot and dumb one, because who doesn't want to sometimes be hot and dumb? So, Sarah Sanderson it was. So the first thing I always do with a costume is start sketching. And I usually start with a main sketch as I'm watching whatever it is I'm going to be recreating. And this is where I go into all the details, such as we've got the little poof on the side of the skirt, red skirt underlap on the purple skirt. So there's a bit of the purple goes over the red. There's fringe bottom on the red skirt. There's a blush voile under the red panel, and there's a green underlayer under the purple. Then looking at the bodice, I've just got some quick seam lines drawn so I know approximately where to do them. Got the grommets in here where the straps attach. Notice that there's some sequins on it. Then I started looking into the sleeve and the fact that it's attached to the bodice directly. There's enough ease that she can raise her arms. Sometimes they're sequins, sometimes they're not. The cuffs are kind of destroyed, kind of not, and they change length throughout the film, so they obviously had multiple pieces. Then looking at the bodice, these are harder to see sketches. Basically that there's no shaping, it's very flat, and that it's a lace up the back. When I was doing research, we first see the Sanderson sisters in 1693, and it looks like they took inspiration from stays of 1693, which isn't quite a corset that we would think of, so I just called it a bodice because we've still got metal grommets and more modern things. Quick little sketch of the shorts that go underneath. So then, once I had my main sketches done, I went through and looked at where all the different skirt layers lay and how they overlap, where on the red it lays, and these are all my different images about how long it should be, where it hits, and that was a lot of research watching the film. I also looked into the cape and how that should be done. That'll be at a later date when I have more time. And then I looked at all the rings, which was another watch through of the film, not that I minded, and figured out where all the rings go. In my exploration, I watched the movie again, I did some research, and I realized that although her outfit looks one way in the film, in real life it's actually different fabrics. Now this is because a lot of times in film they apply filters. What I decided to do was go off of the stills from the film because I wanted that authentic film feel. So with that in mind, the first fabric I needed to find that the rest of the outfit hinged upon was the fabric for her bodice. Now I'm saying bodice instead of stays or corset because it is more of a stays-inspired look from the 17th century because of when the Sanderson sisters were set in Massachusetts. I can't say that word, but let's pretend it's okay. And I'm using a pattern based off that, but there are more modern pieces to it, like she has metal grommets. It doesn't have the tabs at the bottom, which are technically necessary because they help relieve the pressure of the boning. Anyways, with that in mind, I found this fantastic fabric from Anne's Fabric in Hamilton, which is a nice taffeta that has a little bit of a shift in color depending on which way you orient it. It's very subtle, but that was what I wanted. I'm gonna have to add the embroidery myself. After that was found, I managed to pick up this really cool, really cheap fabric that I'm going to attempt to dye like a raspberry red for the sleeves. I also have this beautiful purple crepe fabric for the cape. I got about 3 yards, 3 meters. I can't remember off the top of my head. It's been a while. I've been collecting fabric for a bit. But it's nice and lightweight and flows beautifully, which is what you want when you're flying through the air on a broomstick. A very similar but heavier weight purple for the outside of the skirt. And those were actually the easiest fabrics to find, believe it or not. The next fabric I knew I needed was her front panel of the skirt, which is a nylon laser cut crocheted red? I'm not sure. I couldn't find it. So instead, I found this fabric, which is a very similar pattern, or close enough when it's all bunched together, and I'm gonna attempt to dye it bright red. We'll see how that goes. I also have thigh highs because she wears completely era appropriate thigh highs. Then we have the little bits that are hard to see but I still wanted to get. There's this beautiful voile for under the red panel. It's a very skin blush color. I also have this greeny, olivey, almost yellow color that goes under the purple skirt, and we just see the peaks at the side. And last but not least, excuse me, sweetie. Okay, beep, beep, beep. She helped. I have this pink broadcloth. I don't recommend broadcloth, but in this case I wanted something really cheap for the shorts that she's wearing underneath everything. And that is all the fabric and a cat. To start the dyeing process, I took my dye poly color, put it in a mason jar with hot water and mixed it there, then poured it into a large stock pot that I keep specifically for dyeing. I ended up doing all my dyeing in my basement on a heating element, like a hot stove, just so that it would not get all over my kitchen. I did some samples first, small strips of the fabric, to make sure that the color was going to end up the way I wanted it to. It was a bit too orange and warm toned, so here I am adding some blue color just to cool it down a touch and get it into the more raspberry tones that I was aiming for. It takes a long time to dye. There's a lot of time spent kind of stirring the pot, waiting. Not shown here, I did end up adding some vinegar because I was using a nylon material, and that helps set the dye with nylon. The dye that I was using was an dye poly with some RIT dye. The RIT dye is the liquid dye that you see me pouring in. Once I finally had a sample that I liked, it was time for me to do the actual fabric, which is the fun part. I checked that there was no other samples in the pot, then I took the fabric that was pre-washed and got it completely soaking wet. Once it was wet, I knew that it would take the dye evenly throughout the material, and I brought it over to the pot and carefully put it in. Well, as carefully as I was able to. The trick is to try and make sure that none of the folds stay folded for too long, because it'll take the dye differently. I use an old wooden spoon that is specifically for dyeing, which is why it's 50 million colors, and just keep stirring, picking it up, putting it back in, making sure that the folds are shifting, and you just keep dyeing forever and ever and ever. I think I did it for 1 or 2 hours. We won't make you watch that. To make this skirt, I specifically wanted to start with the waistband. Keeping the fabric folded in half, I measured out the length of the waistband, making sure to add 3 inches for the overlap in the back. I doubled that measurement and added seam allowance, trying to ignore a cat wanting my attention, and then marked it all out. Oh, gotta add that seam allowance on the end too. I ended up just cutting a straight strip because I needed the rest of the fabric to not have any holes in it. Notched the center just so I knew exactly where the center front was, and then cut that edge. I also cut the extra bit off one side so we only had an overlap on one side. Measured out where the front marking would be for the red and then notched it. I gave it a really good press, then flipped it over and started ironing down the seam allowance on both sides. Takes a moment, but a nice hot iron always makes a difference. I like to use a lot of steam because I knew the fabric could take it. Once that was done, I folded it in half and quickly realized that I had miscalculated and that my waistband was going to be way too thick. I ended up cutting off the seam allowance, folding down a new seam allowance, pressing that, and then folding it in half, and I was quite happy with the width. I like to have all the crease marks marked so that I know exactly what it's going to look like in the end, and I know exactly where I'm sewing. I marked down all my partitions, then I took my large purple fabric and cut it in half widthwise. This way I could do both halves because the center back closure was, as it said, in the center back. The next step was to take each piece and do a hand basting stitch along the top edge. I could have done this by machine, but for some reason I just figured hand was the way to go for this one. It ended up taking a while. Once that was done, I pinned it on one side, as well as the other side, making sure that all the gathers were even. I also triple checked that I was pinning it to the correct side of the waistband so that when I folded it the way I wanted to, it would look right. Next, I took our red lace that we had dyed and turned out well, figured out how long it was going to be, and then cut along the edge. Now, a lot of times I would cut straight, but because this has that great pattern and I couldn't find a fringe in a color that I liked, I decided to cut along the pattern here. It was not fast. I ended up making the front panel a little wider at the bottom, so I just cut up on a diagonal towards the top. I knew that this was going to be gathered, but not as gathered, so just gave an approximation of how wide. I also took the blush voile that was underneath of the red lace, figured out the length, which ended up being just a little short, and I should have double checked my references. There's a note for you there, again. And I just ripped along the bottom. Because the voile gathers very nicely, I ended up not having to take any of the width out. Then when that was done, it was time to baste along the top edge of both the lace and the voile, and then I could pin the center front along the marking and gather it in to match where my other mark was. For the lace, this was about an inch overlap over the purple. You can see me doing both sides here. And then the voile was over top of the lace, going an additional about inch over top of that. Again, just pinning it in the center and then pulling it over. And the way I'm doing this is the things that are on the bottom is what ends up on the front, which is why I'm doing it in reverse order, from front to back, as it were. Then for the green, although it's more of a beige here, I cut it in half once again, and we're going to basically copy what we did with the purple on top, again with the green. It's not as gathered because I didn't want to add too much bulk underneath, but I basted along the top on the machine, pinned it on both sides as where my notches were based on my skin, and once it was gathered, stitched it down. I ended up actually stitching the layers separately, which isn't shown here, but you can do it either way. Once everything was stitched down, I flipped the waistband onto itself the right way and stitched it down. Then I went to the center back seam, which is where the two sides basically are, attached the green together and attached the purple together, leaving the top 6 inches undone. The waistband had a snap put on it, and then when it's closed, you actually can't see the opening of the 6 inches because the purple is so gathered. Then for the hem, all I did was mark it when I was in the shoes and tear it off so it left a raw edge on the bottom. And easy peasy. Ooh, and here's Persephone being a supervisor and a good cat. Never stood there, ever. Do you want to be a center of attention? Hi. Okay. Can we get back to it? Why?